In 1926, one of the most incredible events happened in the mountains of North Alabama. A group of school children were startled when a feisty 100-year-old Native American woman suddenly appeared from the thick forest that surrounded their school. There, standing on their playground, was a towering 6-foot-tall Cherokee woman toking on a cornpipe with 6 chickens and a dog behind her, like a living ghost from a long-forgotten era. Her husband had just died, and now she was homeless. But who was she, and where did she come from? Well, my friend, I'm glad you asked. And this is the incredible true story of the life of Granny Dollar. Nancy Callahan Dollar was the last surviving member of the last surviving Indian family who lived in the area now known as Buck's Pocket State Park. She was born in 1827 beneath a spreading button tree to her half-Irish and Cherokee mother and her full-blooded Cherokee father named William Callahan. It was here that young Nancy would spend her childhood, playing Native American games such as dog and fox. Nancy and her siblings never attended school. Instead, they worked the fields alongside their mother, growing corn and potatoes. Well, Nancy did go to school for one day at least, as she told it. But on the first day there, a boy was going around bullying all the girls, pulling their hair and such. And when he got to Nancy, she pulled out a bowie knife from underneath her dress, and after putting it to the boy's throat, the teacher told her to never come back again. So that was the end of her public education. Nancy's father was a towering man, standing 6'5" at 275 pounds. He was powerful strong, and Nancy always said he was like an Indian Goliath. Like all Cherokee men, he was a master fisherman and hunter. Thus, he spent all his days providing meat for his family. One day, when Nancy was a young girl, her father came home with a large buck, and the family celebrated. There was a large feast that night. But her father appeared sad and wouldn't eat a single bite. His wife questioned him relentlessly until he finally spoke. "I cannot eat my meat," he said, "for fear that my Cherokee wife and my 3 little children are hungry tonight, there in South Carolina, and I was forced to leave them there." Upon hearing this, his wife replied, "Go and fetch them. There's plenty of room here, and plenty to eat." Now that statement might strike many folks today as odd, yet it was very common for Cherokees to have more than one wife back in those days. And after all, as Nancy would later recall, her mother truly didn't mind. Indeed, she greeted the new arrivals with warmth and joy. The day they arrived, she had baked potatoes and venison prepared in her brick oven to celebrate their arrival. And afterwards, the 2 women labored, working the crops and having babies. Both women would each have a set of triplets, and all told, there were eventually 26 kids. The family was literally a tribe. They fed on turkey, venison, fish, cabbage, corn, pumpkin, squash, hominy, and johnny cakes and molasses, all of which was cooked in the red clay oven that was outside of their home. By the 1830s, the family came under attack during the forceful removal of all natives, known as the Trail of Tears. Nancy's family was forced to hide on the west side of Sand Mountain, near the Tennessee River, before escaping through the woods and hiding at a place called Saltpeter Cave. Now, although she was only 14 years old, each night for weeks, Nancy would sneak 4 miles back through the woods to their cabin and return with potatoes until the soldiers had finally left the area. But their freedom was short-lived, as soon her father was confronted by a white man named Jukes, who threatened to turn the Cherokee's family's location over to the authorities. And in return, Nancy's father bit off the white man's nose and one of his ears. And because of this, the family was forced to move over the state line into Georgia to a place called Marthaville, about 30 miles outside of Atlanta. By now, Nancy was 21 years old, and her Cherokee mother had died. Even worse, her father's hunting and fishing skills were now useless in their new home. Thus, Nancy did all she could to help provide food for her 25 siblings. She settled on mule skinning and driving a covered wagon 30 miles each day, hauling goods from Marthaville to country stores that were located near her home. She greased axles, hitched mules, and conquered the rutted roads that were soaked by rain and baked by the sun as she loaded and unloaded molasses and meat and salt and gunpowder and lead and gun caps and shoes, dishes and wagon wheels, and whatever else was available in the wild region. Now, it was a dangerous job, especially for a woman, but Nancy was tall and stout, just like her father. She stood 6 feet tall, and never once did anybody ever try to rob her. Nancy was set to wed a man named Tom Porter, one of the storekeepers that she visited every day. However, the war between the states broke out, and he was shot and killed in the battle for Atlanta. Nancy's father was also shot in that same battle, and before he died, he sent word for his daughter not to ride her wagon back into the city. Yet Nancy already knew. Although she was more than 30 miles from the battle, she later recalled the sounds of the booming cannon thunder that were still burned in her memory, as she couldn't forget the terrible sounds from that battle for the rest of her life. And shortly after the burning of Atlanta, Sherman's troops marched through her farm and ravaged all her crops. Suddenly, Nancy's father and future husband were gone, and she was left to provide for her family, which she did until they were all grown and they started their own families. Yet Nancy grieved the loss of the man she had intended to marry for 40 years. Somehow the woman who had never had a child of her own had raised her own 25 siblings. It was only once Nancy Callahan was 79 years old that she finally married a man named Nelson Dollar. And since they were too old to have children, her husband gave her a puppy named Buster a few years after their wedding. And together they lived a good life. But sadly, after 20 years of marriage, Nancy was widowed at the age of 100 years old. Remarkably, she had raised and outlived all 25 of her brothers and sisters, and now her husband, the woman who had cared for so many, was now alone in the wilderness with no one to care for her. So that's how it was that in 1926, Granny Dollar walked out of the Appalachian forest near Lookout Mountain in northern Alabama at 100 years old and appeared on the playground at a private Catholic school for boys during recess with nothing but her faithful 15-year-old dog Buster and 6 chickens. The owner of the school was away on business in California, but the school's nuns took in the elderly woman and put her up in a small cabin on the school property. And Granny, she made herself right at home, immediately putting the 50 schoolboys to work, splitting her firewood and hoeing a garden spot for her, and bringing her meals each and every day. A few months later, the school owner returned and he was informed about the homeless Native American woman that the nuns had taken in, and the property owner agreed to let the fragile old woman stay, rent-free without even seeing her. But to his surprise, the very next day, Granny Dollar walked into his cabin as he sat reading his newspaper. Without hesitation, the feisty old woman started out. "Morning, sir. My name is Nancy Dollar, but everyone calls me Granny Dollar. And I'm an Indian, and us Indians don't want to fool nobody. So I thought I'd come and ask you some questions before I decide if I'm going to live here for the rest of my life." The man put down the paper as Granny continued. And first of all, y'all don't eat no meat at this school. But I tell you, I gotta have a little fat in my biscuits and some fat meat to boil with my cabbage and turnip greens. And I also noticed that y'all don't let the boys chew and smoke. But I just gotta have my bacca. And also, can I keep my dog Buster? I just can't live without him. And what about my chickens? I got 6 chickens. Now don't worry about them getting in your gardens and such. These are Indian chickens, and they wouldn't touch a cabbage or lettuce or any sort of vegetable, even if they were starving. And I have to have my roosters. I love to wake up in the morning each day and hear them crowing and answering each other. It's just like music to me. Also, I see those nuns making them boys pray every day. And I'm Indian, and we don't pray. We conjure. I hope you understand. Without hesitation, the school owner agreed to let her keep all of those things. But just before Granny turned to leave, she asked one more question. And sir, I've never sat in a rocking chair all my life. Won't you give me that rocking chair that you're sitting in? I'd rather have it more than anything I've ever seen in my born days. So the man stood up, and Granny, at 100 years old, put the chair on her head and headed back to her cabin. So it was. The Catholic school kindly let Granny Dollar live in a small cabin for the rest of her life. Each day, she could be seen wearing blue denim and barefooted, planting flowers and sunbathing and working in her garden, raising strawberries and potatoes and cabbage and corn. Folks from all over East Tennessee, northern Georgia, and Alabama began making pilgrimages to see her, and she welcomed them all nearly every day, with Buster sitting in her lap, who would savagely attack anyone who tried to get too close to her, and then turn and lovingly look towards Granny. All the while she was rubbing on her pet 17-year-old hen that she called Brownie. She conjured visitors' warts and ailments away, told their fortunes by tracing lines on her hand with her rusty pocket knife, and then she would reminisce about the pioneer old days, with stories about where the Cherokees buried their gold, to an endless crowd of spellbound listeners. When asked about the difference between Indians and the white men, Granny once replied, "My father's hut was enjoyed by all, but another race has taken our fields, our forests, and our game. Their children now play where we were once so happy. But the trouble with the white man is they quit working at 50 or 60 years, and when they stop working, they get out of touch with nature, and they wear shoes in the summer that keeps their feet from touching God's good earth. Soon they begin to fail, and then they're dead." During the winter of 1930, Granny fell powerful sick, and she instructed one of her caregivers to open an old chest that she had at the foot of her bed. There, tucked away and wrapped in blue paper, were 23 large $1 bills. She asked them to make sure that it was used for a tombstone for her, and a few months later, Granny Dollar and Buster died. It was then that Granny's last wishes were carried out by the poor mountain community that had come together and filled Granny's bedroom and performed a Native American dance around her body before burying her in an oak casket in the tiny graveyard next to the Little River Baptist Church on Lookout Mountain. Granny Dollar had been asked about death a few days before she died, and she said, "Law, child, I ain't afeard to die. When an Indian gives himself to God, he belongs to God from that time on. And I gave myself to God a long time ago, and I'm just waiting for him to call me home. I know there's angels all around us, if we could just see them. And I suspect that before I go over yonder, I believe God's going to let me see them and let him hold my hand as I'm crossing over." The Appalachian Storyteller would like to thank our members whose generous contributions make true stories like this one possible. If you'd like to help support the cost of research and video production, click the join button below. Thank you for your support.